The night air over Yorktown tasted like smoke and river mud. Drums thudded low in the dark, muffled by sod and newly cut fascines. Men hunched in the trenches waited for the word, fingers working at flint screws, knuckles raw from days of digging. Somewhere left, the French batteries answered in steady rhythm, hot barrels beating a kind of iron heartbeat across the water meadows. Overhead, the shells traced slow arcs and fell into the British lines with a crunch that you could feel in your teeth. On the Allied right, Alexander Hamilton led light infantry toward Redoubt 10 with unloaded muskets, bayonets fixed, and axes ready to tear through abatis. They wanted speed more than fire. The men crossed the ditch like men who had practiced in nightmares, climbed, shoved, clawed, and fell into the redoubt in a surge of bodies and shouts. Shots went off at powder-burn distance. A grenadier tried to swing a musket as a club and went down under boots. 6, 7 minutes, and the defenders folded. On the Allied left, French troops under de Viomenil and Lauzun took Redoubt 9 with the same brutal clarity. When the stars came back out over the smoke, the noose had another knot in it. That night did not come out of nowhere. For weeks, the Allied army had been building toward this moment like a rising drumroll. George Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau had marched south from New York in a carefully kept secret, their columns slipping across New Jersey and down through Philadelphia, while false signals and empty camps kept Sir Henry Clinton wondering whether New York was still the prize. At sea, Admiral de Grasse's fleet held the mouth of the Chesapeake, like a locked gate. When the Royal Navy tested it in early September, cannon smoke blew across the bay and the British withdrew. The river became a wall, and Cornwallis found himself garrisoned in a trap he had helped to build. The ground around Yorktown is a low, cut-up country of ravines, orchards, and fields bounded by split rail. The British line wrapped a crescent around the town, batteries and redoubts knotted together by trenches and palisades. Washington's engineers read it like carpenters read a frame. On the night of October 6th, the Allies broke ground on the first parallel, a trench line that crept across the front under darkness and rain. The work was mud and blisters, laying gabions, hauling fascines, cutting saps toward the enemy, while musket balls hissed and shovels thunked into clay. By October 9th, the guns opened. The town shook. The bombardment began like a thunderstorm that refuses to move on. Day by day, the Allied batteries multiplied, French heavy guns, American mortars, field pieces dragged into position with curses and bare hands. They smashed embrasures, toppled gun carriages, and set warehouses and tar barrels on fire until smoke hung over the river like a gray roof. Washington personally touched off one of the first guns, a gesture both symbolic and practical. He wanted every man to understand that this would be decided by weight of metal and the endurance to keep feeding the pieces. Cornwallis understood the arithmetic. He sent sorties to spike guns, threw up new works, and waited for a fleet that did not come. The British fired heated shot at the Allied batteries and raked the trenches with grape shot, but each hour the dirt grew taller on the Allied side and shallower on his. The town filled with the wounded and with the frightened, soldiers, sailors, runaway enslaved people who had sought British lines for promised freedom, and civilians who had guessed wrong about where safety lived. The river, brown and wide, kept its own counsel while the guns talked. After the redoubts fell, the Allied saps leapt forward again. Guns rolled into the captured works and began to speak at point-blank range. British parapets slumped and split. On October 16th, Cornwallis tried a gambler's throw. Before midnight, he ferried light infantry and German troops across the York River to Gloucester Point, hoping to cut through the French cavalry that guarded the far bank and slip away toward the open country. The weather turned against him. A sudden squall came hard off the bay and tore boats loose, scattering men into black water and broken plans. The crossing collapsed. The trap held. The next morning, the Allied guns opened with a fury that sounded like the end of patience. Batteries hammered the British inner lines until guns fell silent one by one, and the town looked like a picked bone. A note went up under flag of truce. Negotiations began in a small house called the Moore House. Washington required that the garrison march out with colors cased and drums beating a British or German march, not Yankee Doodle. He refused to put his own name to a paper that sounded like boasting. The articles said what they needed to say and no more. At noon, drums rolled and the redcoats came out between files of Allied soldiers, French in white and American in blue and brown, stacking arms in ordered piles while fifers wheezed a tune that some swore was "The World Turned Upside Down." Many Americans looked not at the defeated, but at their own threadbare ranks, boys and old men who had marched farther in a month than they had eaten. In the crowd were enslaved men and women who had pinned their hopes to British proclamations and now saw those hopes collapse with the broken gun carriages. Victory carries its own silences. Across the ocean, the news dropped like a stone into still water and sent waves through Parliament. The king wanted to fight on. Ministers counted ships, coin, and patience, and shook their heads. In the Allied camps, men wrote letters with shaking hands because they understood, as ordinary soldiers rarely do in the middle of a war, that they had stood at the hinge. Yorktown did not end every skirmish. It ended the argument. The British would negotiate. A new country would have to prove it was not just an army in the field, but a nation that could carry its weight in peace. The siege left other marks less neat than a signature. The French alliance, tested on long roads and longer councils, walked off the field stronger than it had arrived. American staff work, engineers, quartermasters, gunners, learned how to coordinate a large joint operation with a European army and a fleet. Washington learned that deception, speed, and secrecy could outweigh a strong wall. And thousands of people who had been property in law looked at the rhetoric of liberty in campfires and orders of the day and measured it against their own lives. The war's end promised a beginning that would not come at once. Years later, visitors walked the grassed-over trenches and tried to hear what the ground remembered. They pointed at the place where the parallels ran, at the house where the articles were signed, at the river where the storm came down, and imagined the noise. But if you want the moment, you go back to that October night, to men stepping over the lip of a trench with bayonets fixed and throats dry, to a general standing behind a gun carriage with a linstock in hand, to a fleet crouched at anchor between two capes while the tide turned. You listen for the first quiet after the last gun, for the kind of stillness that falls when history changes direction and men know it. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.